Hi, Scott Orlin with CINEMA-Magazin. I am here in our continuing series of Cinema Out of the Box, this time bringing you an award-winning casting director, David Rubin, who also happens to be president of the Motion Picture Academy in Arts and Sciences. But we're going to start with casting. David, in kind of broad strokes, just kind of introduce the audience to what the job is of the casting director.
The casting director collaborates very intimately with a filmmaker in figuring out what actors, when cast in particular roles, will most vividly bring a story to life. So there are many steps to the process, but the primary part of it is a collaboration that happens mostly behind closed doors, which is why it's a bit of a mystery job, where a director and I have conversations about the story that we want to tell, the kinds of actors that the story requires, and then step by step talking about each of the characters to try to figure out what the possibilities are in populating the world of the film. So it really is about opening up various avenues into storytelling, so that, you know, when a screenwriter writes a screenplay, they write the descriptions of the characters very specifically. They'll say it's a white man in his 50s, he's overweight, he has a limp, he has a glass eye, whatever it is, very specific. And the writer doesn't write those descriptions for the director or for the casting director. They, in all honesty, write it for the financier of the movie, so that when they're, for the person who's going to pay for it, whether it's a studio or a production company, so that when they're reading the screenplay, the movie comes to life in their head, just the way when you read a novel, when something is described in great detail, it becomes more vivid. When it comes times for us to put together a cast, part of my job as casting director is to, in some ways, ignore the specifics of the way a character is described, only focus on how that character affects the narrative, affects the story, and then discuss, bring to the conversation with the director the many possibilities of ways of playing that role. Does it have to be a man? Couldn't it be a woman? Does it have to be a white guy? Could it be an Asian person, a person of color? Can it be a little person? Does it have to be that age? And really just talk about how that character impacts the story. And by doing so, we experiment. So the casting process is really a laboratory where the director is hearing the lines of the script out loud, sometimes for the very first time, and imagining the various permutations of telling the story.
Some of the laboratories that you've worked in are Gravity, Men in Black, Hairspray, The English Patient, Theatrical, Rules Don't Apply. And so that means you've worked with Warren Beatty, with Sidney Pollack. You know, talk a little bit about, does each director have his own kind of tempo, his own method, or is it kind of pretty much standard?
None of it is standard. I think every director has their own approach to the casting process. Some of them embrace it wholeheartedly and have a huge appetite for it. Some of them come to the process with fairly rigid ideas, and then my challenge is to loosen that rigidity and to open them up to possibilities. Because when you do that, you start to really imagine various versions of it, and it can be a very exciting part of the process. Sidney Pollack, for example, who himself was a fantastic actor and began his career before he was a director, not only as an actor but as an acting teacher, has such compassion and empathy for the actors in the audition process that he actually couldn't bring himself most of the time to audition actors. He hated putting actors in that position because I think it brought back all of the anxieties that he felt as a young actor. So truthfully, thanks to technology and the use of video in the casting process, Sydney actually preferred me to do really almost the entire casting process and just show him the results of my working with the actors. So you know, but other people, for example, I did many movies directed by Danny DeVito, and he had a huge appetite for the process, getting in, rolling up his sleeves, trying different things with the actors, experimenting with their approaches to the audition material. And a number of directors I've worked with, Jay Roach among them, have had taken great delight in the sort of experimental process.
So let me ask you, if there are actors watching this now, what is an essential key aspect that they should bring into an audition? And what is a big mistake that sadly some of them bring into that audition?
The key to bring, let me start over. The biggest piece of advice I can give to any actor in the audition process is to bring yourself in the role. Because it is the only thing that any particular individual actor can bring to an audition that no other actor can bring is their voice, their sensibility, their impressions of what that character would be. And conversely, the biggest mistake you could make is to pander to what you think the people on the other side of the table are looking for. And I know that many actors will walk into a waiting area in a casting office, for example, and they will look around and they'll go, oh, yeah, that's sort of how I saw that part. That guy's probably going to get it. Or maybe I should try to be more like that because, you know, the truth, when I read the script, that was in my head. The fact is that those of us who are watching those auditions, we have a sense of what we're looking for, but what we are hoping for is to somebody to walk in that room and change the molecules in the room, change how we thought the character would be, and by delivering their authentic self, we suddenly start to see the character in a whole fresh new way. And I think what I tell most actors when I'm asked this question is the best thing you can deliver is your authentic self, admittedly in artificial circumstances. You know, you're auditioning for a murderer. That doesn't mean you've had to have murdered somebody, but you put yourself in that position so that everything feels organic and truthful to your own way of envisioning yourself in that circumstance. Because the camera lens is one of the world's greatest, I hope I can say this, bullshit detector. The camera lens can read thought. And if it's false, if it's artificial, if it's put on, if it's not tied to who you are emotionally, temperamentally, we'll see it. And it won't register. So I always say, bring your authentic self.
I gave a laundry list before of some of the incredible films that you worked with, and there's a myriad of many, many more. But you've also now kind of been heavily involved in TV. I mean, for people out there, obviously Big Little Lies, and most recently, which just played in Germany, which was Little Fires Everywhere. And I have to compliment you watching that. I thought those kids of Reese Witherspoon and Joshua Jackson could literally have physically been their kids. It looked like...
Well, that's high praise indeed. I mean, that's part of the challenge in casting a family is to try to get, you know, a sort of genetic match that feels, you know, authentic. The challenge, the additional challenge in Little Fires Everywhere had to do with finding, because each of those characters had their own fairly intense storyline and own sort of story arc and journey during the 8 episodes. So to find people who fit resemblance-wise, look and sound-wise, that they could be Josh's and Reese's kids, but also to be able to handle a storyline that they essentially carry over that many episodes was the challenge. And truthfully, a lot of those kids, only 1 or 2 of them had real extensive experience, and a lot of those kids, this was the biggest challenge. so far in their careers, and it was tremendously rewarding to see how they met that challenge, because I think they did such a beautiful job, not just the kids of Reese and Josh, but the actress who played Kerry Washington's daughter as well. You know, they had a lot on their shoulders, and they really pulled it off, and that's one of the reasons that attracted me to that particular show and script, because it had so much to do with parents and children, and I love the challenge of trying to find kids who could handle the dynamics, the dramatic dynamics of that story. So I'm really pleased that it's been so well received.
I'm going to ask you to be humble for just a second. In these almost 3 decades of casting, has there been somebody you've discovered? Has there been somebody that maybe, I don't want to say fell through the cracks, that you just went, I see something in that person?
Boy, it's a question I always avoid, because I always feel as though casting directors, my colleagues in the casting world, are watching as much as we can. We go to as many plays in the theater as we possibly can, watch as many movies, see as many offbeat independent films as we can. And the truth is, when somebody comes along with a really unique talent, there are many of us who recognize it, and only one person gets to be the first person to give them an opportunity in which they shine. So the whole idea of discovering somebody, is not, I can point to a movie in which the list of actors are those who were just hitting their stride, and I'll particularly point out The Talented Mr. Ripley, in which Matt Damon and Jude Law and Gwyneth Paltrow and Cate Blanchett and Philip Seymour Hoffman had begun to do work in films. But it was exactly at that time, when we were lucky enough to assemble them in a cast, where they really sort of became bona fide movie stars. So, it's not so much a case of finding them at an open call, let's say, and suddenly they've landed on the scene, but it is about being lucky enough to find material that gave them the chance to be indelible in a film. So I sort of prefer to look at it that way, that you were lucky enough to find those opportunities. There are certainly, for the lead in Hairspray, where we needed somebody with a very specific type, and that was a true, like the search for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. We spent, and the producers and the studio and the director Adam Shankman all had an appetite to spend a lot of time on that search, and this was before the internet became such a huge tool in doing a broad search. So we literally traveled from city to city and did open auditions with these wonderful plus size teenage girls lined up around the block, and we saw thousands and thousands of kids. And now we do the same thing, but we do it on the internet. But Nikki Blonsky, who came from complete obscurity and had that entire film on her shoulders. But I think of it less about discovering somebody for their career than discovering somebody out of the blue for a particular role. Because I think if I were sort of obsessed with finding somebody and launching a career, I wouldn't be a casting director. I would be an agent, I think, or a manager, who I think are involved in finding somebody early on and mapping out a career for them. Every actor that I give an opportunity to very early on in their careers, I'm thrilled that I'm able to do it, and I want them to have a long and prosperous career. But my focus, in all honesty, is, are you right for this role in this movie?
Speaking of roles you were right for, last year you were elected to be the president of the Motion Picture Academy, people who run the Oscars, and that was the first time a casting director has ever held that position. While there is a casting branch, there is no casting award yet for the Oscars. the Academy, the Television Academy has stepped up and done that. Is it about time? Do you, as a casting director with that hat on, is it about time that they get their due recognition?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why it's taken a while for casting directors to get recognition. When you think of the various people who make films, most of them do it in plain sight on a movie set. Anybody who works in movies knows pretty much what's involved in a cinematographer's job. They're behind the camera, they're helping light a scene. Everybody understands what a costume designer does. They do sketches of costumes, they try various things on actors, they have dialogue with a filmmaker about how a particular costume will help an actor play a role and embellish that particular character in the story. But the casting process takes place behind closed doors before almost everybody else is on a movie. After a screenplay is written and a director is on board, we are the next people hired, and we finish our job before the cameras roll. So the Motion Picture Academy and all other organizations that give awards are made up of people who work on movies, but the truth is they have very little to do with the people who do the casting. So part of it is that, and part of it is that the skill and the art of our job is the dialogue that we have, the collaboration we have with a director, where we have a deep understanding of the screenplay and of how each character plays their part in the telling of the story. And the way we suggest and in many ways convince directors to make specific choices that will spin the way a character is being played in an unexpected way, and also to know so much about the abilities of actors that we are able to imagine in advance what will happen when a particular actor rubs up against a particular character on the page, and in some ways also a particular actor will rub up against, if you will, another actor in a particular scene. And that's because we've made our life's study what actors do and how well they do it and how versatile they are in doing it. So that's what we bring. But for other people to understand that unique dynamic is very different. There's no equipment involved. An editor sits at an Avid editing machine. And in some ways, when you think of those things, or a sewing machine for a costume designer, or choosing a lens for a cinematographer, that's a skill and a craft that is easy to acknowledge and therefore to reward or give an award to. The psychological conversations that I have with a filmmaker are very difficult for even film professionals to understand. So I know why it's taken this long. This is a long-winded answer, but the other part of that equation is that the casting director is a relatively new position on films that actually didn't come into play until the studio system failed in the mid-1950s. Actors up until that point were under contract to studios. And the minute that stopped and actors weren't assigned roles right off of a list because the studios ostensibly owned them, suddenly filmmakers had the option to cast any living, breathing actor for their movies. And they needed somebody to direct that process. So that's only a couple of decades, really, when you think about it, since the movie studio system failed. So we're sort of the new kids on the block. But in answer to your question, is it rewarding to me that the Television Academy recognizes the excellence in the casting field? 100%. And there's a certain sweet coincidence in the fact that the night that I was elected president of the Motion Picture Academy, the British Film Academy, for the first time in its history, announced that they were giving awards for outstanding achievement in casting. So there's certainly a trend. It is not my agenda as president of the Academy to mobilize toward an award for casting. I have plenty of other things on my plate as the president of the Academy to contend with. But of course, it's rewarding when my colleagues are recognized.
Well, I cannot thank you enough, David, for taking the time to share with our audience this insight into the casting process. And I look forward to seeing some of the incredible work that you've done, and we're going to get to see soon. So
I appreciate the invitation. It's great to see you, Scott.
Great. And this is Scott Orlin. Till next time.